Forgiveness. Preface. A call to genuine healing in a world wounded by misunderstanding. Humanity today speaks endlessly about forgiveness. It is preached, demanded, expected, and woven into religious, psychological, and cultural conversations. Yet in spite of all this, true forgiveness is rarely experienced. Instead, the world is flooded with suppressed hurts, festering resentments, surface-level reconciliations, and forced apologies that never touch the core of the human spirit. People say, "Forgive and forget," but they neither forgive nor forget. They only bury their wounds until they resurface as distrust, hatred, fear, or emotional numbness. Others believe that forgiveness is the same as excusing wrongdoing, allowing abuse to continue, tolerating injustice, or pretending that evil has no consequences. Some even weaponize forgiveness to control others, demanding pardon while refusing transformation. This book is written because humanity has lost sight of what forgiveness truly is. It has mistaken emotional bypassing for spiritual liberation, weakness for compassion, and self-erasure for love. As a result, the world suffers under heavy chains of unresolved pain. The Grail Message shines a clear, penetrating light on this subject, exposing misconceptions while revealing the living, lawful process that underlies genuine forgiveness. It shows that forgiveness is not a human invention, not a mere emotional posture, and not a moral command imposed from outside. Forgiveness is a spiritual reality, rooted in the immutable laws of creation, particularly the laws of reciprocal action, attraction of homogeneous species, and spiritual gravity. Forgiveness is not achieved by mere intention. It is not produced by force. It is not granted by words. It occurs only when the spirit aligns with truth. This book is therefore a call to return to clarity, to sobriety, and to personal responsibility. It is an invitation to every wounded human being, every person carrying guilt, and every person longing for release, to step into the radiant truth that liberates. Forgiveness, seen rightly, is not sentimental. It is not soft. It is not indulgent. It is transformative, just, and exact. It is a process that frees the sincere, humbles the arrogant, lifts the suffering, and restores harmony to the soul. Above all, it is a pathway, one that leads the human spirit back into the light, purified, lighter, and whole. Introduction. Seeing forgiveness in the light of truth. How the Grail Message reveals the spiritual mechanics behind guilt, pain, and release. Forgiveness is one of the most misunderstood realities in human experience. Everyone desires it, yet few understand how it operates within the spiritual laws that govern all of creation. The Grail Message reveals that forgiveness is not simply a moral duty, but a law-governed process of spiritual readjustment, rooted in causality and personal transformation. To understand forgiveness, one must first understand guilt. Not guilt as an emotion, but guilt as a spiritual condition, a disharmony created whenever a human being chooses wrongly, acts wrongly, or wills wrongly. Through the law of reciprocal action, every deed and every thought returns to the doer, bearing the imprint of his own volition. Thus guilt is not a punishment inflicted from outside, it is a natural consequence produced by the human being's own radiations. Forgiveness, therefore, cannot mean cancellation of consequences. It cannot mean erasing the effects of wrongdoing. It cannot mean reversing the law. Forgiveness is the process by which the spirit, through insight, remorse, transformation, and a sincere change of will, comes back into harmony with the laws of creation. The guilt dissolves only when the inner state that produced it is corrected. The Grail Message calls this, the recognition of wrong and the earnest striving toward the good. This truth removes confusion on many fronts. Forgiveness is not passivity. Forgiveness is not tolerating evil. Forgiveness is not denying pain. Forgiveness is not reconciliation at any cost. Forgiveness does not abolish justice. Rather, forgiveness operates within justice. It uses justice as its foundation. Only through the law's unbending activity can a human being come to the clarity necessary for true remorse. Only through the painful harvest of one's wrong decisions does the spirit awaken to the need for change. And only when the inner transformation is genuine does release, the thing called forgiveness, occur. Forgiveness is therefore inseparable from truth, responsibility, insight, change, restoration of right inner volition. This makes forgiveness a spiritual science, not an emotional impulse. It is a living interaction of radiations, a cleansing of the inner environment, and a reharmonization with the light. This book will explore how the laws of creation bring about guilt, how these same laws open the door to release, what humans must do to truly forgive and truly be forgiven, why many modern concepts of forgiveness are spiritually harmful, how forgiveness heals the spirit, the heart, relationships, and destiny. In the light of the Grail Message, forgiveness is revealed as a pathway of liberation, a correction, and ultimately a rebirth for the human spirit. It is not merely a remedy for emotional wounds, it is a decisive step toward spiritual maturity and eternal progress. This book is written to guide the sincere seeker through that process. Part 1. The True Nature of Forgiveness. Understanding forgiveness is a spiritual process, not an emotional gesture. Chapter 1. What forgiveness really is: a release in the laws of creation, not a sentimental act. Forgiveness is one of the most misunderstood concepts in human life. Across religions, cultures, and traditions, people speak about it as though it were merely an emotional decision, a gentle feeling, or a moral ideal. Many imagine forgiveness as trying to feel good again, or letting someone off the hook, or forcing oneself to forget. But none of these touch the true spiritual reality behind forgiveness. The Grail Message reveals a deeper, far more powerful truth: forgiveness is a lawful release within creation itself. It is not manufactured by human sentiment, nor achieved by emotional suppression. It is a spiritual process governed by the inviolable laws of creation, particularly the law of reciprocal action, the law of spiritual gravity, the law of attraction of homogeneous species. Within these laws lies the true mechanism of guilt, consequence, and liberation. Forgiveness is not an emotional bandage. Most people try to forgive by pressuring their feelings. I shouldn't be angry anymore. I should move on. I must show kindness. I have to be the bigger person. But this is merely surface control. Emotional pressure does not resolve the spiritual threads that bind individuals through their actions. It does not dissolve the radiations that were damaged. It does not correct the inner distortions that produced the hurt. Whenever forgiveness is attempted through emotional performance, the inner wound remains. At best it sleeps. At worst, it mutates and re-emerges later, often as resentment, bitterness, guilt, or deep inner coldness. True forgiveness is never achieved through sentiment. It requires inner clarity, an alignment with the laws of creation. Forgiveness is the release of radiational knots. Every wrong, whether committed by oneself or against oneself, creates a knot in the radiational web of spiritual existence. This knot forms through a distorted thought, a harmful intention, a destructive word, a damaging action. These distortions bind the spirit to consequences. The Grail Message explains that they cannot simply disappear. The law ensures that every action returns to its origin. This return is not punishment, but enlightenment. It allows the spirit to recognize, correct, and purify itself. Forgiveness, therefore, is only possible when the wrong has been recognized. The inner attitude has been corrected. The spiritual threads can dissolve because the wrong no longer finds support in the soul. Forgiveness is a real process, not symbolic. It is the loosening of actual threads that tie one to guilt or to another's guilt. Forgiveness begins with truth, not emotion. The modern world encourages instant forgiveness, a cheap, superficial gesture meant to look noble. Yet nothing in creation works instantly without inner transformation. Just as a seed must sprout, grow, and unfold in accordance with natural law, forgiveness must pass through stages. Recognition of the truth. A sincere change of will. Release of the radiational burden. Restoration of inner harmony. Skipping these steps leads to false forgiveness, a spiritual deception that benefits no one. The Grail Message shows why truth must come first. Only what is recognized can be transformed. Without truth, forgiveness becomes a fantasy. With truth, forgiveness becomes light. Forgiveness is not the cancellation of consequences. Another widespread misconception is the belief that forgiveness erases consequences. It does not. The laws of creation never suspend themselves. Forgiveness does not. Cancel the harvest of one's deeds. Eliminate the need to learn. Magically remove effects that one has set into motion. Instead, forgiveness transforms the inner attitude so that the returning consequences purify rather than crush. When the inner condition changes, when the spirit sincerely rejects the wrong, the consequences no longer reinforce darkness, they serve as stepping stones to higher development. Thus, forgiveness is not escape, it is redirection. Forgiveness restores freedom of movement. When a person carries guilt or hurt, the spirit becomes heavy. Intuition weakens, perception darkens, decisions become clouded, the individual becomes bound to cycles of pain, shame, or retaliation. Forgiveness, when authentic, lifts the weight. The spirit becomes free to rise again, to receive help, to recognize guidance. It is like the loosening of chains that were once strangling the inner life. This freedom cannot be manufactured. It arises naturally when the inner condition aligns with the light. Forgiveness is not weakness, it is lawful strength. The world often mistakes forgiveness for passivity or softness. But true forgiveness requires courage to face the truth, humility to correct one's inner posture, strength to rebuild the radiational harmony that was damaged, spiritual maturity to release resentment or guilt, a firm will to return to the light. Forgiveness, genuine forgiveness, is an act of spiritual power. It is a re-entry into harmony with the will of the Creator. Forgiveness is a bridge back to spiritual health. At its core, forgiveness is healing, not emotional healing but spiritual healing. It restores the natural radiational flow between the spirit and the light. It reopens the pathways of intuition. It softens the soul. It breaks cycles of pain. It allows new, fresh currents to stream into one's inner being. Forgiveness is the spirit's return to breath. Its return to balance. Its return to humility. Its return to truth. Forgiveness is the return to freedom. A person who forgives truly does not excuse wrong. They do not trivialize hurt. They do not pretend. They simply step back into harmony with creation, allowing the light to dissolve what their own will has released. Thus, to forgive is to rise. To forgive is to become lighter. To forgive is to be spiritually healthy. To forgive is to stand in truth. Forgiveness is the release of all that binds the spirit to darkness, achieved through clarity, corrected inner volition, and the movement of the light within creation's laws. Chapter 2. The Misunderstood Foundation of Forgiveness, Why Only Truth Can Dissolve Guilt. Forgiveness has been clouded by centuries of emotionalism, false humility, religious distortion, and human sentimentality. People speak of letting go as though it were a mere feeling, a noble gesture, or an act of moral superiority. Others force themselves to forgive, even when their inner being remains wounded, confused, or in turmoil. Still others believe that forgiveness is the act of excusing wrongdoing, erasing consequences, or pretending nothing happened. All of this is illusion. All of this is untrue. And all of this has led humanity into deep spiritual confusion. To understand forgiveness, one must first understand truth, because only truth can dissolve guilt. 1. Forgiveness is rooted in law, not emotion. The Grail Message reveals that all events in creation unfold within inviolable laws. The law of reciprocal action. The law of attraction of homogeneous species. The law of spiritual gravity. And others. These laws ensure balance, harmony, justice, and clarity. They are perfect in their operation and incapable of injustice. Thus, when a human being commits wrong, whether through thought, word, or action, this wrong sets a radiational process into motion. It creates a form, a weight, a consequence that must, by law, return to the doer. Forgiveness, then, cannot be the cancellation of consequences. It cannot be the bypassing of law. It cannot be an emotional, I forgive you. Forgiveness is the dissolving of the radiational knot created through wrong action, but only when certain inner conditions are fulfilled. Emotions do not dissolve radiations. Sentiment does not annul spiritual threads. Only truth has the power to untie what guilt has bound. 2. Guilt is a living force, not an idea. Humanity thinks of guilt as a feeling. But in reality, guilt is a spiritual burden, a condensation of distorted radiations formed by wrongdoing. It surrounds the human spirit like a cloud, weighs it down, and draws it toward similarly dark currents. This is why guilt torments. This is why guilt persists. This is why guilt cannot be wished away. Guilt is an objective reality in the spiritual world. Therefore, forgiveness must meet the same level of reality. It must occur on the plane where guilt actually exists. This is why truth is essential. Only truth penetrates into the spiritual realm with enough luminosity to dissolve what has been formed there. 3. Sentiment cannot replace truth. A person may say, "I have forgiven them. I let it go. I moved on. I don't want to think about it anymore." But deep within, the wound remains alive. The wrong remains unresolved. The consequences still stand. This is because the human being has attempted to forgive, using emotion instead of truth. Emotion is transient. Truth is eternal. Emotion fluctuates. Truth clarifies. Emotion hides. Truth exposes and heals. Forgiveness that does not begin with truth is nothing but a thin veil stretched over a festering wound. It may appear noble. It may sound spiritual. But it has no power in the laws of creation. 4. Truth begins with recognition. Before forgiveness can even begin, there must be accurate recognition of the wrong committed, of the harm caused, of the responsibility carried, of the spiritual laws violated, of what must be corrected and realigned. Truth is light, it illuminates. Without illumination, darkness cannot be dissolved. This is why confession is powerful, not confession as ritual, but confession as inner clarity. The moment a person clearly sees their wrongdoing, the radiational distortion begins to loosen. The knot begins to unravel. The spirit begins to breathe. Without truth, guilt remains, even when the mind attempts to deny or suppress it. 5. Forgiveness requires the turning of the spirit. Forgiveness is not an external act. It is an inner movement, a turning toward the light. Guilt binds a person only as long as they continue to radiate in the same dark direction from which the wrong arose. But the moment a person turns, genuinely and deeply, the radiations change. New currents begin to flow. Light penetrates the old knot, weakening it. This turning is called repentance, not as emotion, but as transformation. Repentance is clarity. Repentance is recognition. Repentance is change. Only then can forgiveness occur. Not because the wrong is excused, but because the wrong has been transformed. 6. Forgiveness is not passive, it is creative. Forgiveness is often imagined as a passive act, someone granting it to another. But in reality, forgiveness is creative work in the spiritual layers. It requires inner honesty, deep humility, courage to face oneself, readiness to make amends, willingness to change the direction of one's life. The person wronged may choose not to harbor hatred. But that alone does not dissolve the guilt of the wrongdoer. Their guilt remains until they themselves engage the process of truth. Forgiveness is therefore a twofold radiational event. The wronged person releases resentment and frees their own radiations. The wrongdoer recognizes, realigns, and transforms their inner state. Only then does true forgiveness complete its course. 7. Truth is the only path to real freedom. Forgiveness without truth creates hypocrisy. Truth without forgiveness creates hardness. But truth leading to forgiveness creates liberation. When truth illuminates guilt, the spirit becomes free. When truth dissolves the radiational knot, the spirit rises again. When truth restores harmony with the laws of creation, life can move forward in purity and strength. Forgiveness is not a favor. It is not charity. It is not emotional surrender. It is not spiritual superiority. Forgiveness is alignment with the light, the great restoring power of truth. And only in truth can guilt melt away, like darkness before dawn. Chapter 3. Forgiveness is a radiational correction, how the light breaks inner knots and restores balance. Forgiveness is often spoken of as if it were an emotion, something a person feels when their anger subsides. But in the light of the Grail Message, forgiveness is revealed not as a feeling but as a radiational event, a correction within the spiritual threads of creation. Every human action, whether thought, word, or deed, creates a form, a current, a knot within the radiational web that surrounds the actor and the affected person. Guilt forms when a human being acts contrary to the laws of creation. It becomes a dark knot, dense, heavy, and magnetically bound to the spirit until rectified through reciprocal action. Forgiveness, therefore, cannot simply be declared. No human can wipe away the consequences of another's wrongdoing by an emotional gesture. The law does not bend to sentimentality. Forgiveness happens only when a knot of guilt is loosened through an inner correction, aided by the light when the person genuinely strives upward. In this sense, forgiveness is a living process, not a pronouncement. The light is the great corrector. The light, radiations of purity, truth, and order, acts upon all things. When a person awakens to remorse, not the emotional regret that fears consequences, but the genuine recognition of wrongdoing, a new radiation begins to emanate from their spirit. This contrition opens cracks in the hardened knot of guilt. The light enters. Where the light penetrates, distortion loosens. What was rigid begins to soften. What was dark begins to dissolve. This is forgiveness as radiational correction, the light restoring order where disorder was created. And forgiveness is never complete until the person actively changes. The movement of the spirit, real, living transformation, is the true signal that the light has done its work. The Grail Message teaches, forgiveness is the dissolution of guilt through the working of the light when the human spirit opens itself to it. Thus, no one gives forgiveness. Rather, one receives it through genuine inner change. Forgiving others, what it actually means. When a person is hurt by another, the law of reciprocal action begins its work immediately. The wrongdoer must bear the consequences of their action. Nothing the offended person says can cancel this. So what does it mean to forgive others? It means releasing oneself from bitterness so that the dark knot does not anchor itself in your own radiation. It means not binding yourself to the offender through hatred, emotional obsession, or desire for revenge. It means remaining open to the light, so that the injustice does not drag you downward. Forgiveness, therefore, is inner freedom, not the removal of another's guilt. When understood this way, forgiveness becomes not an emotional burden, but a spiritual liberation. Chapter 4. Guilt, Repentance, and Forgiveness, the threefold path of genuine inner transformation. Human beings interact with the laws of creation every moment of their lives. These laws are perfect, incorruptible, and automatic. They do not punish. They merely react to the nature of what has been set in motion. Thus, the path from wrongdoing back to balance is not arbitrary or emotional. It is structured, precise, and spiritually logical. It can be understood as a threefold process. Guilt. Repentance. Forgiveness. 1. Guilt. The consequence of violating a law. Guilt is not a psychological sensation, it is an objective spiritual reality. Whenever one acts contrary to purity, justice, or love, a darkening occurs, first within the person's radiations, then in the threads of their fate. This is guilt, a real formation attracted to the spirit, binding it until correction is achieved. Many try to defeat guilt by ignoring it, denying it, distracting themselves, or claiming no regrets. But guilt does not vanish through defiance, it becomes heavier. The Grail Message makes clear. Guilt is a living knot that remains until dissolved through genuine change. 2. Repentance. The turning point. Repentance is not fear of consequences, nor emotional apology, nor self-pity. True repentance is the awakening of the spirit, a sudden clarity in which the person recognizes, what I did was wrong. It violated the laws of creation. It caused harm. It was unworthy of my spirit. In this recognition, a shift occurs. The spirit bends in humility. A softening begins. The inner door cracks open. Repentance is the moment when the spirit stops resisting the light. True repentance birthingly expresses itself in a will to change, a will to make amends, a will to strive higher. Without this living will, repentance is merely sentiment. 3. Forgiveness. The dissolution through the light. When repentance creates openness, the light enters the radiational knot of guilt and begins dissolving it. Forgiveness, then, is the final step in the transformation. Forgiveness is not forgetting. It is not pretending. It is not emotional reconciliation. Forgiveness is restoration of radiational order. When the knot dissolves, the spirit breathes again. The chain breaks. The person rises. Peace follows, not because guilt was erased, but because the law has been satisfied. The three must always work together. There is no forgiveness without repentance. There is no repentance without recognition of guilt. There is no release without the working of the light. This threefold path is one of the greatest blessings in creation because it makes spiritual healing possible, even for those deeply entangled in wrongdoing. Part 2. The spiritual laws governing forgiveness. How the laws of radiations, reciprocal action, and attraction of homogeneous species form the basis of true forgiveness. Chapter 5. The law of reciprocal action. You cannot escape what you have sown, but you can transform it. Every genuine understanding of forgiveness must begin with the recognition of an unchanging truth. Nothing in creation is ever lost, overlooked, or erased arbitrarily. The consequences of every thought, every word, every deed move outward in creation like a wave, and these waves, formed of radiations, must return to their origin. This is the law of reciprocal action, the great rhythm of justice woven into the very fabric of existence. Human beings have misunderstood this law for millennia. Many imagine forgiveness to be a divine cancellation of consequences, a heavenly wiping away of guilt with a single emotional gesture. Others believe that if they simply feel sorry or express remorse, the effects of past actions vanish. But the Grail Message corrects this deeply rooted misunderstanding. Forgiveness does not abolish the harvest. It only provides the inner transformation necessary to alter the quality of the harvest when it returns. The law cannot be broken, but it can purify. Because the law of reciprocal action is perfect justice, every person must one day meet the effects of their choices. This meeting is not punishment, it is enlightenment. It is the mirror given by God so that the human spirit may finally see itself clearly. But the human being is not a passive victim before this law. Through sincere change, genuine repentance, and a shift in inner volition, the returning effects can be softened, redirected, or transformed. What would have been harsh can become instructive. What would have been destructive can become redemptive. What would have crushed the spirit can instead awaken it. This is why forgiveness in the true sense is always linked to inner change, not emotional relief. When the inner state changes, the seeds in the soil of destiny respond. The Grail Message teaches that if the will becomes purer, the radiation it emits becomes purer. If the radiations change, they alter the pathway of returning effects. If the returning effects meet a changed soil, they themselves are changed. Thus, forgiveness is neither escape nor exemption, it is transformation. Why you cannot forgive yourself by emotion. Modern humanity often says, "I forgive myself," thinking forgiveness is a psychological soothing or an act of self-kindness. But no person can forgive themselves through words, affirmations, or feelings, because forgiveness is not emotional, it is radiational. When guilt is present, it is not merely a feeling, it is a knot in the radiational fabric of the human soul. That knot cannot be dissolved by comfort, denial, or self-compassion alone. It requires a change in the inner volition, a living movement toward truth. Only then can light penetrate and loosen the knot. In this sense, forgiving oneself simply means aligning oneself with the truth so that the returning effects encounter a cleansed and awakened inner state. Why no one can forgive another in the human sense. Human beings cannot remove the consequences of another's actions. You cannot erase another's guilt or neutralize what they have sown. What people often call forgiving others is simply letting go of personal bitterness, which is noble, but it is not the spiritual act of forgiveness itself. The true forgiveness that dissolves guilt happens between the soul and the divine laws, through recognition of wrong, sincere remorse, a changed volition, active restitution or amend-making when possible. Only then does the light begin its work of loosening the radiational knots. The liberating message of the law. Though strict, the law of reciprocal action is not merciless, it is deeply compassionate. It ensures that no human being can ever be eternally trapped in guilt. That growth is always possible. That transformation is always available. And that justice always moves toward healing, not destruction. The law does not condemn, it educates. It does not crush, it awakens. It does not imprison, it refines. Humanity suffers today because it imagines consequences to be punishment instead of enlightenment. When one sees every returning experience as a teacher, forgiveness becomes not a plea for escape but a path of renewal. Transformation. The heart of true forgiveness. A person who truly seeks forgiveness does not say, "Let this pass from me." Instead, they say, "Let me become one who can meet what returns with clarity, humility, and strength." This shift is the beginning of liberation. Forgiveness, then, is not about removing consequences, but about purifying the one who must receive them, so that the returning effects no longer bind but uplift. In the light of the Grail Message, we see clearly. You cannot escape what you have sown. But you can rise above who you were when you sowed it. And when you rise, what returns rises with you. This is the majesty, justice, and mercy of the law of reciprocal action, the divine foundation upon which all true forgiveness rests. Chapter 6. The Law of Attraction. Why unforgiveness draws darkness and forgiveness attracts the light. Unforgiveness is not merely an emotional heaviness, as most people believe. It is a spiritual magnet. It is an active radiation, a living force that pulls to itself whatever is of the same nature. The Grail Message explains that every inner state radiates, and through these radiations, one attracts what corresponds to his condition. Whether an individual is conscious of it or not, the laws respond unfailingly. Unforgiveness, therefore, is not simply holding a grudge. It is a radiational alignment with darkness, a state where one's spiritual atmosphere becomes heavy, opaque, and disturbing to the natural harmony of the light. The one who refuses to forgive binds himself, not the offender, to lower spheres of existence, where bitterness, suspicion, fear, and hostility thrive. Forgiveness, the opposite, is not the emotional saying of pleasant words or the forced display of niceness. Forgiveness is a release of radiations, a breaking of inner knots, whereby the individual rises again into a purer stream of the light. Through this rise, he attracts clarity, peace, and help from higher spheres. The law of attraction does not care about intention, it responds to condition. And this law silently governs the mystery of forgiveness. 1. Unforgiveness is a radiational descent. When a person refuses to forgive, what he usually feels is a tightening inside, a heaviness in the chest, or a tension in the stomach. But spiritually, the picture is far deeper. Streams of dark radiations begin to coil around the individual, creating a dense cloud that blocks intuitive perception. This happens because unforgiveness is rooted in wounded pride, desire for revenge, fixation on the past, self-centered suffering, refusal to let the light correct what has happened. These inner states all belong to lower radiational spheres. Thus, through the law of attraction, the individual becomes connected to forms and currents that nourish resentment, suspicion, or hostility. In this condition, he becomes vulnerable to influences that magnify his pain, distort his perception, and harden his heart. This is why people burdened with unforgiveness often relive the past repeatedly. They are literally radiationally attached to it. 2. Why unforgiveness draws darkness. The Grail Message teaches that everything dark draws darkness, and everything bright draws brightness. Darkness is not moral evil, it is spiritual heaviness, states of untruth, impurity, and distortion. Unforgiveness draws darkness because it closes the inner being. It blocks intuition, which is the channel of light. It fuels negative thought forms. It creates discordant vibrations in the aura. It keeps the spirit turned backwards instead of forwards. Thus the individual finds himself increasingly irritable, unable to feel joy, suspicious of good intentions, easily offended, mentally exhausted, spiritually stagnant. Darkness can only cling where darkness is present. Unforgiveness provides that landing place. 3. Forgiveness is a rise into the light. Forgiveness is not letting someone get away with it. In the laws of creation, no one ever escapes what he has sown, unless he truly transforms within. Forgiveness simply means that you yourself stop holding onto that which binds you downward. Forgiveness raises the human spirit because it breaks inner knots. It dissolves radiational heaviness. It reconnects the person with the light stream. It restores clarity. It brings peace and strength. Forgiveness is a sign that a person has grown out of the lower planes of turmoil and into the luminous realm of objective perception. He stops reacting from emotion and begins responding from spirit. In this state of inner clarity, higher radiations flow freely again. And because like attracts like, the individual begins drawing peace, intuition, solutions, help, inner warmth, spiritual guidance. Forgiveness aligns one with the light, and the light always attracts more of its kind. 4. Why forgiveness attracts help from above. Help from higher spheres cannot flow into a spirit whose aura is clogged with bitterness or revenge. But once forgiveness clears the inner atmosphere, the spiritual vessel opens again. Forgiveness attracts the light because it creates openness, humility, sincerity, willingness to understand, release from self-centeredness, readiness to move forward. These qualities shine like clear tones, resonating upward. And from above, help descends without obstruction, because the individual's radiations have become homogeneous with purity. This is why people often say they feel lighter after forgiving. It is not psychological, it is radiational. 5. The law of attraction is the silent judge. Forgiveness and unforgiveness are not moral categories, they are radiational positions. The law of attraction does not punish or reward, it simply follows the eternal structure of creation. You attract what you are. You rise to where you belong. You remain where your radiations anchor you. Unforgiveness anchors downward. Forgiveness lifts upward. Thus, the individual determines, not with his words, but with his inner state, what currents he will swim in and what experiences will form around him. 6. The practical implication. Forgiveness is self-protection. Many resist forgiveness because they believe it benefits the offender. But spiritually, forgiveness is self-preservation, because it frees you from radiational binding, protects you from dark influences, lifts your soul into clarity, restores your connection to intuition, reopens your path of spiritual growth. Forgiving someone does not erase consequences of their actions in the laws. It simply means you refuse to bind yourself to their error. Forgiveness is the refusal to descend. It is the choice to remain luminous. It is the decision to stay aligned with the light. In conclusion, unforgiveness is a magnet that draws darkness. Forgiveness is a magnet that attracts the light. Each person chooses his world through the state of his inner radiations. And through that choice, destiny unfolds. Chapter 7. The Law of Spiritual Gravity, How the Soul Rises Through Forgiveness and Sinks Through Resentment. Forgiveness is often thought of as a soft emotional gesture, an act of kindness, pity, or moral nobility. But in the light of truth, as unveiled in the Grail Message, forgiveness is revealed as something far more profound, a law-bound movement of the human spirit. It is a motion that either lifts or sinks the soul, depending entirely on its inner state. This chapter brings to light the often ignored spiritual law that governs this movement, the law of spiritual gravity. Just as physical bodies are subject to material gravity, the human spirit, composed of a finer substance, is subject to spiritual gravity. It rises to its homogeneous sphere when it is light, free, and purified, and it sinks when burdened with heaviness, hatred, bitterness, or resentment. Forgiveness, then, is not merely a virtue. It is a release from heaviness, enabling the spirit to rise. Resentment is not merely a fault. It is a weight, an anchor that drags the soul downward into darkness. Let us unfold this law with clarity. 1. The spirit is naturally buoyant, it is made to rise. Every spirit originates from the luminous heights, from a realm where purity, truthfulness, and love are natural states. Its very nature is light. When unclothed by guilt, fear, bitterness, or falsehood, it naturally rises, just as a flame naturally reaches upward. Forgiveness restores the spirit to this natural buoyancy. It removes inner knots. It loosens burdens. It dissolves radiational heaviness. It cuts threads that bind the soul to darkness. When the spirit forgives, from genuine clarity and truth, it becomes lighter, radiant, and able to ascend toward what is higher, noble, and luminous. Forgiveness therefore aligns perfectly with the law of spiritual gravity, which draws what is light upward to the light. 2. Resentment is a weight. It sinks the spirit. Resentment, bitterness, hatred, vindictiveness, no matter how justified they may appear outwardly, create dense radiations within the human soul. These radiations are heavy. They correspond to dark, lower regions of creation. Whatever is heavy must follow the law governing its nature, it must sink. Thus a person holding resentment is not merely emotionally troubled. He is spiritually descending. His intuition becomes dull. His inner sight becomes clouded. His spiritual connection weakens. His radiations darken, attracting other dark currents and entities. His inner life becomes congested, oppressive, and limited. This descent happens automatically, without external punishment. It is the natural consequence of his inner weight. The law of spiritual gravity reacts immediately to the person's inner state. 3. Forgiveness removes the weight that impedes ascent. One of the greatest revelations of the Grail Message is that forgiveness is not about excusing wrongdoing, nor about emotionally forcing oneself to feel differently. It is about releasing oneself from inner chains, breaking free from dark threads of hatred, loosening connections to harmful radiations, restoring the soul to its natural lightness. Forgiveness lifts, not because a person tries to be nice, but because a spiritual law is activated. Lightness rises. Heaviness sinks. When you forgive, you stop feeding dark currents. You withdraw your radiation from toxic entanglements. You deepen your connection to light. You become receptive to help and clarity again. You regain inner mobility and spiritual strength. Forgiveness is therefore not a gift to the offender, but the liberation of the forgiver. 4. How bitterness forms radiational chains that bind the soul. Whenever resentment is held, thought forms and emotion forms emerge, dark, knot-like structures that attach themselves to the soul's radiational body, the aura. These knots pull the soul downward, attract similar dark currents, law of attraction, strengthen karmic threads of reciprocal action, block pure intuition and guidance, irritate and disturb the nervous system, create restlessness and inner pressure. This is why resentment feels heavy. It is heavy. It is literal radiational weight. Forgiveness dissolves these knots. It cuts cords. It breaks loops of dark reciprocal action. It neutralizes harmful attraction. It restores radiational purity. Through forgiveness the soul becomes unburdened, mobile, receptive, and luminous once again. 5. True forgiveness is impossible without truth. Many try to forgive through sentimentality or self-deception. But the laws of creation cannot be fooled. They respond only to truth. Forgiveness must come from an inner recognition that hatred harms oneself. That bitterness is a poison one drinks hoping the other will die. That clinging to pain sinks the soul. That release is necessary for spiritual ascent. That peace is found only in alignment with light. Forgiveness that is forced, false, or merely verbal has no effect. It does not release weight, therefore it does not lift. Only forgiveness born of clarity, an inner seeing of the truth, has the radiational power to transform. 6. Forgiveness is a motion toward the light. Forgiveness triggers an upward radiational movement because it harmonizes the soul with the pure currents of light. It removes obstacles to spiritual help. It restores alignment with the natural laws. It opens the intuition to nourishing energies. It increases the spirit's vibrational purity and strength. It is not sentiment that lifts the soul, it is the release of all that is foreign to the light. This is why Christ said, "Forgive, not as an emotional request but as a spiritual law." To forgive is to live. To forgive is to rise. To forgive is to return home to the light. 7. Resentment is a motion toward darkness. Just as forgiveness is a movement upward, resentment is a movement downward. It pushes the soul deeper into distress, confusion, inner coldness, mental heaviness, fear, inner paralysis, darkness. A person who refuses to forgive is not hurting the offender, they are damaging themselves through self-inflicted spiritual descent. The law of spiritual gravity does not change because a person feels justified. Darkness always sinks. Light always rises. The soul's position is determined strictly by what it harbors within. Conclusion of the chapter. Forgiveness is not a favor one gives another. It is the soul's release into light through the operation of the law of spiritual gravity. Resentment is not a weapon against the offender. It is the self-inflicted descent into darkness through the heaviness of hate. The Grail Message makes clear. Forgiveness is liberation. Resentment is imprisonment. Forgiveness lifts. Resentment sinks. Forgiveness restores the soul's natural radiance. Resentment drags it away from the light. To forgive is to rise. To hold bitterness is to fall. With this understanding, forgiveness becomes not a moral choice, but a spiritual necessity, the very gateway through which the human spirit regains its luminosity, clarity, and upward motion. Chapter 8. The Justice and Mercy of the Law. Why forgiveness never cancels justice but completes it. Forgiveness, as most people understand it, is sentimental, emotional, and dangerously incomplete. It is often imagined as a soft blanket thrown over wrongdoing, a kind of emotional escape hatch through which both the offender and the offended can simply move on without penetrating the truth of what has transpired. But in the light of the Grail Message, forgiveness reveals itself to be something far more profound, far more exact, far more liberating. What humans mistakenly call mercy is often weakness, what they call justice is often harshness. But in creation, justice and mercy are not opposites, they are two expressions of the same radiant lawfulness. Forgiveness does not overthrow justice, it unlocks it. Forgiveness does not negate consequences, it transforms them. Forgiveness does not excuse wrongdoing, it clarifies it and leads to renewal. To understand forgiveness is to understand the inseparable unity of justice and mercy in the laws of creation. 1. Human mercy is emotional, divine mercy is lawful clarity. When a human being says, "I forgive you," the statement is often loaded with emotional pressure, inner conflict, or even secret resentment. Sometimes it is said out of fear of losing the relationship, sometimes out of weakness, sometimes out of societal conditioning. But none of this has anything to do with spiritual forgiveness. True mercy is not blind. It does not pretend that nothing happened. It does not demand silence about wrongdoing. And it never, never, protects evil from its consequences. Rather, divine mercy is clarity. It reveals what has gone wrong, why it went wrong, and how the soul can correct itself. In creation, mercy is the light illuminating the consequences of one's actions so that a person may learn, grow, and become purified. Mercy is revelation. Justice is manifestation. Forgiveness is transformation. 2. Why justice is indispensable for forgiveness. Many misunderstand forgiveness as cancellation of consequences. But nothing is ever cancelled in creation. Every thought, every word, every deed has already set a radiational thread in motion. The law of reciprocal action ensures that this thread returns to the originator, carrying with it the matured fruit of what was sown. This is not punishment, it is education. The returning effects force the soul to see what it created, to feel what it caused, and therefore to recognize its own errors. Without this recognition, there can be no genuine repentance. Without genuine repentance, there can be no transformation. And without transformation, forgiveness cannot unfold. Forgiveness cannot bypass justice because justice is the pathway to forgiveness. To be forgiven means that the consequences have fulfilled their purpose, they have awakened the soul to truth. Thus, justice is not an obstacle to forgiveness, it is its foundation. 3. The role of repentance, opening the gateway of mercy. A person often cries for forgiveness while still clinging to the same attitude, the same pride, the same blindness that produced the wrongdoing. This is why many suffer. They confuse forgiveness with emotional consolation. True repentance is not sorrow, tears, or verbal apologies. Repentance is inner reversal, a turning away from the old attitude, a sincere transformation within. Repentance softens the soul. It opens the radiations. It makes the spirit receptive to the light. Where repentance arises, mercy can enter. Where mercy enters, justice becomes restoration, not burden. Justice is not abolished, it becomes purposeful. Forgiveness unfolds when the human being willingly aligns with the truth revealed through justice. 4. Why forgiveness without truth is impossible. Many try to forgive because they are tired. Some try because they want to appear righteous. Others try because they fear conflict. But no one can forgive what they have not understood. Forgiveness requires that the wrong be recognized with piercing clarity, not minimized, not excused, not covered, but seen in its full reality. Only truth dissolves the inner knot. Only truth breaks resentment. Only truth opens the radiational channels necessary for release. Forgiveness that is emotional, shallow, or forced becomes a lie. And lies cannot release anything, they only bind further. Thus, forgiveness is impossible without truth, because forgiveness is the fruit of truth. 5. Mercy completes justice by fulfilling its purpose. If justice is the law that ensures every seed returns to its sower, mercy is the light that enables the soul to understand the return and grow from it. Justice leads the soul to its harvest. Mercy helps the soul to interpret the harvest. Forgiveness is the inner rebirth that follows. Mercy does not remove consequences, it transforms their meaning. For the awakened soul, what once seemed like punishment becomes purification. What once felt like loss becomes liberation. What once felt like shame becomes enlightenment. Thus, justice does not end with suffering. Justice ends with understanding, and understanding gives birth to forgiveness. In this way, mercy completes justice. The two form one harmonious whole. 6. Why resentment is a rebellion against justice and mercy. Resentment is the refusal to accept the justice of the law. It is a clinging to one's own pain, pride, or sense of victimhood. Resentment blocks mercy. Resentment darkens the radiations. Resentment chains the soul to the very event it wants to escape. When a person refuses to forgive, he is not injuring the offender, he is injuring himself. The light cannot penetrate a hardened spirit. Mercy cannot flow into a clenched heart. Justice cannot complete its healing cycle when the individual refuses to learn from it. Resentment is a spiritual rebellion against the very forces that would free the soul. 7. The liberation that comes when justice and mercy meet. When a person recognizes truth, repents sincerely, and opens their inner being, something powerful occurs. The consequences still come, but they no longer crush, they cleanse. The returning threads of one's past become pathways to maturity. The inner weight dissolves, releasing the soul into lightness and clarity. Forgiveness then arises naturally, effortlessly. It is not willed. It is not forced. It is not a decision. It is a state, the radiational result of inner purification. This is why forgiveness never abolishes justice, it completes it. Justice without mercy would harden. Mercy without justice would weaken. But together they uplift. Thus the human spirit stands upright again, clean, clarified, strengthened. This is the forgiveness taught in the Grail Message. A forgiveness that restores, not conceals, liberates, not excuses, enlightens, not numbs. Part 3. The human experience of pain and offense. Understanding hurts, wounds, and betrayal from a spiritual perspective. Chapter 9. The roots of hurt, how expectations, vanity, and attachments create vulnerability. Human beings rarely understand why they feel hurt, wounded, offended, or betrayed. They assume the cause lies outside, in the person who acted, the words spoken, the gesture withheld, the promise broken. Yet the Grail-inspired view reveals a deeper truth. Pain enters only where an inner opening exists. And that opening is most often created by expectation, vanity, or attachment, three conditions that weaken the soul's natural radiational protection. This chapter exposes the hidden origins of hurt so that forgiveness can later arise from clarity rather than confusion. 1. Expectation. The silent architect of pain. Most emotional suffering comes from expectations, those invisible demands we place upon other people, life events, and even God. We expect people to behave a certain way. We expect appreciation. We expect loyalty. We expect love in the way we define it. We expect perfection from others while excusing our own failures. Expectation is a subtle form of self-will. It is the soul saying, I want things to occur according to my imagination. But creation is governed by immutable spiritual laws, not human wishes. When reality does not match fantasy, disappointment arises and wounds open. Expectation creates vulnerability because it places your peace into the hands of another human being, whose own radiations, weaknesses, or struggles you cannot control. The Grail Message teaches that true security lies only in the laws of the Creator, not in human behavior. Thus, every expectation is a risk. Every demand is a weakness. Every mental script you write for others becomes a future source of pain. Freedom from hurt begins with freedom from expectation. 2. Vanity. The ego's sensitive skin. Vanity is one of the most fertile soils in which hurt grows. A vain person does not seek truth, but approval. Not sincerity, but validation. Not justice, but applause. Therefore, the vain individual is easily wounded, because his emotional stability depends on how others see him. A simple comment becomes an insult. Constructive feedback becomes an attack. Another's success becomes a threat. Silence becomes rejection. In reality, what hurts such a person is not what is said or done, but the ego's fear of losing its imagined importance. The Grail Message reveals that vanity is a radiational distortion. It bends perception and makes the person overly sensitive, insecure, and defensive. Where vanity rules, peace cannot remain. Thus, many hurts are nothing more than the ego bruising itself against the truth. 3. Attachments. Chains that amplify suffering. Attachments are emotional bonds rooted not in love but in dependence. They arise when a person clings to relationships, memories, identities, or outcomes as if they were essential to personal survival. These attachments form energetic cords that tie the soul's peace to external objects. When the object of attachment shifts, changes, or disappears, as all earthly things eventually do, the person feels torn, betrayed, or devastated. Attachment creates fear. Fear of losing the person. Fear of being alone. Fear of not being enough. Fear of the unknown. And fear is always painful. The Grail Message clarifies that love is free, flowing, uplifting, but attachment is heavy, binding, and suffocating. Where attachment lies, suffering is inevitable. 4. The spiritual mechanics behind human hurt. Hurt is not random. It follows a law. Pain enters only where the inner vibration is disharmonious. Expectation weakens the radiational field. Vanity distorts it. Attachment restricts it. These inner conditions lower the soul's vibration and make it sensitive to negative radiations from outside. Thus, the wound is not the action of another person, it is the inner condition of the person who receives the action. Two individuals can face the same event. One collapses, the other stands firm. Why? Because their inner states differ. Forgiveness becomes easier when you understand that the person who hurt you did not create the wound, your inner condition allowed it. This is not blame. It is liberation. 5. Recognizing your part is the beginning of healing. True healing begins when you stop pointing outward and start looking inward. Where did I expect too much? Where did my vanity want to be admired? Where did my attachment bind me to someone or something I should have held freely? When these questions are asked sincerely, the fog begins to lift. Clarity enters. Peace follows. Forgiveness becomes natural, not because the offender suddenly becomes innocent, but because you are no longer bound to the place where the hurt occurred. The Grail Message teaches that truth liberates, and nowhere is this more evident than in the process of releasing pain. 6. Pain is a teacher. Every hurt, when properly examined, reveals not merely what someone did, but what you must learn. It may teach you boundaries. It may teach you self-respect. It may teach you humility. It may teach you independence of spirit. It may teach you the necessity of inner anchoring. It may teach you to differentiate love from attachment. Pain is the warning light that something within is out of alignment with the laws of creation. Forgiveness becomes impossible until the lesson is understood. Closing reflection. In the Grail Message, humanity is reminded that no one can wound the spirit unless the spirit has already opened the door. This chapter is a call to reclaim personal responsibility not as self-blame, but as self-liberation. For only when the roots of hurt are exposed can forgiveness take deep root, grow in the soil of truth, and blossom into genuine healing. Chapter 10. Betrayal and the Human Spirit. Why deep wounds push the soul toward awakening. Betrayal is one of the most painful experiences a human being can endure. It pierces deeper than insult, deeper than conflict, deeper than disappointment. For betrayal comes from those to whom the heart has opened itself. It strikes from the inside, not the outside. Yet when viewed in the light of truth, betrayal has a far more profound meaning than the emotional turmoil it brings. It is a spiritual event long in preparation, woven from threads of past choices, reciprocal actions, and inner weaknesses still awaiting correction. It carries within it not only pain, but awakening, exposure, severance, and release. Betrayal, approached correctly, can become one of the greatest catalysts for spiritual growth. The Grail Message does not romanticize suffering. Neither does it glorify pain. But it reveals that pain, especially moral or emotional pain, arises only where a weakness, illusion, or attachment exists within the human soul that must be dissolved for that soul to mature properly. Betrayal is therefore a powerful mirror, held before us by the laws of creation. It reflects not only the act of the betrayer but also the inner state of the betrayed. 1. Betrayal breaks false attachments. Most people do not realize how many bonds they form out of sentimentality, dependency, fear of loneliness, vanity, self-deception, emotional neediness, or comfort. These bonds are not luminous. They are clouds surrounding the spirit, weakening its autonomy and obscuring its inner connection to the light. When betrayal occurs, it is as though the bond is violently snapped. The shock is painful because the bond was not pure. One can never be wounded where love is genuine, free, and anchored in the spirit. One is wounded only where expectation, illusion, or self-interest was mixed into the relationship. Thus the pain of betrayal becomes a scalpel, cutting away what was false. And the sudden exposure left behind forces the soul to stand naked before itself. 2. Betrayal exposes inner weaknesses. The betrayed often imagines that betrayal reveals the darkness of the offender. But more importantly, betrayal reveals the inner condition of the one who feels the wound. If one collapses into despair, it exposes weak inner anchoring. If one burns with vengeance, it reveals pride and ego. If one clings to the offender in desperation, it exposes dependency. If one becomes cold and distrustful, it reveals fear and insecurity. Thus, betrayal is a light that reveals what was already present, hidden but active. In this sense, betrayal is not just something done to you. It is something that pulls out of you what was already dormant. This is why the Grail Message teaches that nothing can harm a human spirit except what the human spirit carries within itself. Betrayal is therefore not only a revelation of another's character, but a revelation of one's own. 3. Betrayal forces the spirit to awaken. Because betrayal strips away illusions, it often leaves a person in a state of painful clarity. Suddenly, the world seems harsher. Motives seem clearer. Truth becomes unavoidable. Self-deceit collapses, and superficiality loses its appeal. In this raw moment, the spirit is pushed into a state of spiritual sobriety. One begins to question. What was I leaning on? What was I blind to? What did I refuse to see? What illusion was I nurturing? Why did I bind myself so tightly to a human being instead of to the light? Betrayal yanks the spirit out of sleep and forces it to awaken to reality. Many great spiritual transformations begin with a betrayal, for betrayal often breaks the shell of comfort that had prevented growth. Without the breaking, the spirit might have remained asleep forever. 4. Betrayal redirects destiny. Every betrayal creates a crossroads. On one path is resentment, bitterness, self-pity, and spiritual stagnation. On the other is clarity, liberation, purification, and growth. The betrayal itself does not determine the path, your response does. If one responds with grudges and clinging to earthly justice, one sinks deeper into darkness. If one responds with clarity, humility, and willingness to mature, one rises. This is why betrayal is spiritually decisive. It is a moment where many destinies pivot. Some rise into greater strength, others sink into hardness. Through the law of reciprocal action, betrayal may also serve to sever connections that have outlived their spiritual purpose. When light wants to free someone from an unhealthy tie, especially one the person refuses to leave, betrayal becomes the tool. It becomes the shock that breaks a chain. 5. Betrayal sharpens intuition and deepens inner independence. After surviving betrayal with correct inner posture, a human being emerges more discerning, less naive, less dependent on human approval, more anchored in spiritual reality, more cautious in forming bonds, more inner-oriented rather than outward-seeking. The spirit is sharpened through the experience. Vanity weakens. Emotional dependency loosens. Blind sentimentality fades. And intuition begins to act more freely, because illusions that once choked it have been dissolved. In this way, betrayal can elevate a person to a higher stage of spiritual maturity, if he receives it in humility and truth. 6. The betrayer's role in the spiritual process. Strangely, the one who betrays often acts as an unwitting instrument of spiritual awakening. This does not excuse the act. The betrayer still bears full responsibility. But the laws of creation weave every event with meaning, and betrayal often comes through those whose weakness aligns with the need for correction in someone else. The betrayer, through his darkness, becomes the trigger for another's ascent. Thus both parties enter a profound spiritual event. The betrayed is confronted with truth. The betrayer is confronted with guilt. Both are invited to transformation, though few recognize the opportunity. 7. The final aim: purification and freedom. The highest purpose of betrayal is not revenge, not humiliation, not punishment. Its purpose is purification. To sever illusions. To dissolve dependencies. To expose weaknesses. To awaken the spirit. To redirect destiny. To free the soul from unhealthy bonds. To force inner maturation. When seen in this light, one realizes that betrayal, though painful, is one of the strongest instruments of the living laws. And when forgiveness later arises, it is not sentimental. It is not forced. It is not emotional. It is the natural result of clarity. Now I see the purpose. Now I understand. I am free. This freedom is the true victory over betrayal. Thus betrayal, in its deepest spiritual meaning, is not the end of trust, but the end of illusion. Not the death of love, but the death of dependency. Not the collapse of the soul, but the beginning of its awakening. Chapter 11. The inner chains of unforgiveness, bitterness, hatred, resentment, and their radiational damage. Unforgiveness is not merely an emotional response, it is a spiritual entanglement. When a person clings to resentment or hatred, these feelings act as inner chains that bind the soul to darkness. The Grail Message teaches that every thought, emotion, and intention emits a radiation, which either attracts light or darkness. Unforgiveness, in all its forms, radiates a heavy, obstructive current that clouds perception, stifles spiritual growth, and draws comparable negative influences from the surrounding world. Bitterness is the first link in these chains. It arises when one dwells on perceived wrongs, nursing a sense of injustice. The more one clings to these injuries, the more the inner light diminishes. The human spirit becomes increasingly hardened, its natural radiance blocked. Even subtle thoughts of blame generate waves of turbulence in the aura, making it difficult for higher spiritual guidance to reach the individual. Hatred is the next, more corrosive chain. Unlike momentary anger, hatred lingers and intensifies over time. It transforms the spirit into a magnet for further discord, attracting energies of a similar nature. This is not punishment, but the natural law of reciprocal attraction at work. What is radiated returns, amplified, to the sender. A heart consumed by hatred cannot perceive truth clearly, its judgment is clouded, and its ability to act with wisdom diminishes. Resentment, often quieter but no less potent, subtly erodes the inner equilibrium. It can hide behind a veneer of righteousness, making it difficult for the person to even recognize the harm they are causing themselves. Its radiations are deceptive, spreading disharmony not only to the self but also to relationships and environments. Friends, family, and coworkers may unconsciously respond to these emanations, creating cycles of tension and conflict. The Grail Message emphasizes that these chains are not imposed from outside but originate within the individual. They are the fruit of human free will misapplied. Each thought of unforgiveness, each refusal to release the offender from inner judgment, solidifies the chains further. Left unchecked, this spiritual bondage can lead to physical, mental, and emotional decline, as the harmonious currents of life are obstructed by the weight of inner darkness. Yet, even in the deepest entanglement, liberation is possible. Awareness of these chains is the first step. The next is the conscious act of releasing resentment through truth, recognition of divine order, and alignment with the higher will. Forgiveness is not a concession to the offender, but a liberation of the self. It transforms radiations, turning a dense current of bitterness into a light-filled flow that uplifts the soul, restores clarity, and harmonizes relationships. The practice of forgiveness, then, is an act of profound self-care and spiritual discipline. It breaks the chains of the past, dissolves the radiational damage, and reopens the pathways for divine currents to nourish the spirit. In forgiving, the human being returns to the state of inner freedom for which they were created, radiating peace and stability outward into the world. Chapter 12. The Psychology of Revenge. Why retaliation destroys the avenger first. Revenge is often perceived by humans as a solution to injustice, a way to restore balance or dignity. Yet the Grail Message reveals a deeper truth. Retaliation is a trap of the self, an inwardly binding force that harms the avenger far more than the offender. It is a spiritual and radiational law that what one directs outward with the intention of harm inevitably rebounds upon the sender, intensifying inner discord and obstructing divine guidance. The psychology of revenge begins in the ego. When the human spirit perceives injury, the ego reacts with indignation, anger, and a desire for recompense. These emotions, if unexamined, harden into a will to retaliate. The mind becomes obsessed with scheming and plotting, focusing attention away from higher understanding and alignment with divine law. In this process, the avenger becomes a captive to their own emotions, their consciousness narrows, and the ability to see the broader spiritual context diminishes. Retaliation radiates a powerful wave of disharmony. Anger, hatred, and the desire to harm generate dense radiations that block the natural flow of life force and intuition. These currents create inner turbulence, often manifesting as anxiety, agitation, or physical tension. Even if the avenger appears outwardly successful, internally they are weakened. The energy once devoted to growth, understanding, and constructive action is diverted into maintaining the cycle of hostility. Furthermore, revenge perpetuates the entanglement of karmic law. The Grail Message teaches that every thought and action emits a radiation that will return in accordance with the law of reciprocal action. When one intentionally causes harm, the destructive force is attracted back, often amplified. Thus, the avenger becomes enmeshed in a spiral of consequences that could have been avoided through conscious forgiveness and alignment with the higher will. The spiritual danger of revenge extends beyond the individual. It disturbs relationships, environments, and the subtle currents connecting all life. Friends, family, and even communities may unknowingly resonate with the avenger's radiations, experiencing tension, conflict, or mistrust. The avenger, in seeking to impose justice externally, unknowingly creates inner and outer chaos. True liberation lies not in retaliation but in conscious release. To forgive is not to condone wrongdoing, but to break the chains of inner captivity. By relinquishing the desire for revenge, the human being reestablishes harmony within themselves, purifies their radiations, and opens to divine guidance. The act of forgiveness transforms the energy that would have been used destructively into constructive spiritual growth, restoring clarity, strength, and peace. Ultimately, the Grail Message reveals that revenge is a self-inflicted imprisonment. Every act of retaliation reinforces inner bondage, while forgiveness is the key to freedom. The avenger who chooses the path of conscious release and understanding steps into alignment with creation's laws, experiencing the joy of a liberated spirit and the radiational harmony that naturally attracts light, love, and truth. Chapter 13. Forgiving and Forgetting. Why forgetting is not required and often impossible. Human understanding of forgiveness has been clouded by a persistent misconception, that to truly forgive, one must also forget. This idea, though popular, misleads the human spirit, placing an impossible burden on memory and misrepresenting the true mechanics of forgiveness as explained in the Grail Message. Forgiveness is a spiritual act, an inner realignment, not a function of memory or denial. Forgetting is often beyond human control, for memory is a faculty designed to preserve experience, learn lessons, and avoid repetition of error. The call to forget can create further inner conflict, as the mind struggles against its natural tendencies, breeding frustration, denial, and sometimes guilt. True forgiveness, according to the Grail Message, operates independently of the memory of wrongs. It is the conscious release of inner negativity and the restoration of radiational balance within the spirit. When a person forgives, they do not erase the experience or pretend it never occurred. Rather, they disentangle themselves from the grip of past events. Forgiveness allows the human being to release the heavy currents of resentment, anger, and bitterness that are bound to the memory of the offense, freeing the spirit without altering the factual remembrance of what happened. Clarity is essential here. Forgiving does not imply approval of the offense, nor does it absolve the other of responsibility. The error or harm remains a part of reality, but its power to disturb the forgiver's inner harmony is neutralized. By holding on to anger or a desire for revenge, one perpetuates radiational turbulence, obstructing the natural flow of life forces and attracting disharmonious consequences. The act of forgiveness, however, channels those energies into the higher laws of creation, restoring balance and light in the inner world. Moreover, the Grail Message illuminates that forgetting can be spiritually dangerous if it masks lessons meant to be learned. Memory serves the purpose of teaching, guiding, and preventing repetition of errors. To erase memory in the name of forgiving and forgetting risks superficiality. It treats only the surface of human consciousness, leaving deeper karmic currents unresolved. Genuine forgiveness engages the inner faculties, reason, will, and conscience, to transmute the experience, transforming the past into wisdom and spiritual fortitude. For the human seeking true freedom, the practice of forgiveness is therefore an internal work, a conscious act of releasing the radiational charge of pain, without the need to manipulate memory. One can recall the offense clearly, recognize its nature, and yet stand free of emotional entanglement. This liberation brings inner peace, strengthens moral and spiritual discernment, and aligns the human being with the laws of creation. In daily life, this understanding offers practical guidance. One can confront offenses in thought or conversation, acknowledge them with clarity, and then intentionally let go of the reactive currents, resentment, bitterness, judgment, without forcing the impossible act of forgetting. Forgiveness becomes a tool of spiritual hygiene. It purifies radiations, restores clarity, and opens the human being to guidance, wisdom, and higher service. Forgetting is optional, release is essential. The Grail Message thus corrects the dangerous myth of forgiving and forgetting. Forgiveness is an act of alignment with truth and law, a conscious liberation from inner bondage, independent of memory. It is the light that transforms the inner landscape, allowing the human being to navigate life with clarity, strength, and inner harmony, no longer a captive of past errors or emotional entanglements. Chapter 14. Forgiving means allowing abuse, a fatal lie. Truth demands boundaries. Among the most dangerous misconceptions about forgiveness is the idea that to forgive is to passively allow continued wrongdoing or to accept harm without objection. This misunderstanding has trapped countless human beings in cycles of victimhood, confusion, and inner conflict. The Grail Message illuminates that true forgiveness is not weakness, nor is it the abdication of justice. Rather, it is a conscious alignment with the laws of creation, which always require discernment, clarity, and boundaries. Forgiveness is an inner act, an emancipation of the spirit from the burdens of resentment, bitterness, or hatred. It does not imply that one must remain exposed to harm, tolerate repeated violations, or negate the necessity of self-protection. To conflate forgiveness with submission is to misunderstand the very purpose of the spiritual laws. Creation operates on principles of order, cause and effect, and reciprocal action. Each being has the right and duty to maintain integrity and uphold truth, which often includes establishing firm boundaries against abuse. The human spirit, when enlightened by the Grail Message, recognizes that forgiveness serves inner freedom, not outer passivity. By forgiving, one releases the inner radiations of anger and reactive energy that would otherwise attract further negativity. At the same time, forgiveness guided by truth empowers the human being to act rightly, including taking measures to prevent recurrence of harm. Boundaries, self-respect, and corrective action are not contradictions to forgiveness, they are its necessary complement. Consider this. Forgiving an offender without changing circumstances or imposing appropriate limits is like releasing the tension in one's own heart while leaving the doors wide open for continued intrusion. Spiritual clarity demands that forgiveness be coupled with wisdom, discernment, and lawful action. This is not vengeance, it is adherence to the laws of creation, which recognize the need for balance, justice, and the protection of life and spirit. Furthermore, the Grail Message clarifies that forgiveness does not remove responsibility from the one who has caused harm. Justice and spiritual law operate independently of the human will to forgive. When we forgive without condoning, we neutralize the personal inner burden while leaving the outer law intact. The offender may still experience the consequences of their actions through natural or spiritual cause and effect. True forgiveness, therefore, strengthens the moral order and restores harmony, rather than dissolving accountability. For daily life, this insight is crucial. A person may forgive verbally, internally, or through meditation, yet simultaneously assert limits, seek repair, or remove themselves from harmful situations. Forgiveness is the liberation of the self from reactive bondage, it is never an invitation to be continually harmed. The Grail Message teaches that the wise human being forgives from the center of inner light, while acting from clarity and discernment in the external world. In essence, forgiveness is not surrender, it is sovereign alignment with truth. The moment humans recognize this, the chains of fear, anger, and false guilt fall away. Forgiveness, bounded by wisdom and guided by law, becomes a source of strength, radiational purity, and spiritual advancement. It frees the human being from emotional captivity, without compromising integrity or allowing injustice to flourish. The fatal lie that forgiveness demands submission is thus exposed. Forgiveness is the liberation of the spirit, and liberation always demands conscious boundaries, truth, and moral courage. Chapter 15. Forgiving means reconciliation. Why reconciliation is optional, not obligatory. A widespread error in human thinking is the assumption that forgiveness automatically requires reconciliation with the one who caused harm. Many believe that to truly forgive, one must restore relationships, re-establish trust, or remove all barriers between themselves and the offender. The Grail Message, however, clarifies this misconception. Forgiveness is an inner process of liberation, while reconciliation is an external act that is entirely optional and dependent on circumstances, truth, and alignment with divine law. Forgiveness is first and foremost an act of the spirit. It unbinds the heart from the chains of anger, resentment, and pain. When a person forgives, they release themselves from the negative radiations that tie them to the offense, whether through conscious thought or unconscious energy. This act of inner release does not necessitate placing oneself back in the presence of harm, nor does it imply that the offender's trust or moral development is complete. To conflate forgiveness with reconciliation is to confuse inner freedom with external circumstance, a grave error that can lead to repeated suffering. Reconciliation occurs only when truth, moral clarity, and mutual responsibility permit it. It is a voluntary alignment of two or more beings in outer interaction, guided by honesty and justice. If reconciliation is premature, forced, or desired merely to satisfy social expectation, it can result in further damage, dishonesty, and the perpetuation of injustice. The Grail Message teaches that wisdom requires discernment. The act of forgiving should be independent of the potential for renewed relationship. One may forgive fully while choosing to maintain boundaries, distance, or protective measures for the sake of truth and harmony. Furthermore, the radiational dynamics involved make this distinction essential. Forgiveness is a purification of the inner field, a correction in the radiational plane. Reconciliation, however, is a physical and social engagement that carries its own consequences and obligations. Forgiveness restores balance within. Reconciliation restores balance between persons, but the first is always necessary, whereas the second is conditional. A spirit that misunderstands this may fall into the trap of self-blame or manipulation, believing that withholding reconciliation is a failure of virtue, when in truth it may be the most responsible choice. Human experience demonstrates the danger of obligatory reconciliation. Attempts to reconcile prematurely or without true alignment of intentions often result in renewed betrayal, emotional confusion, or spiritual regression. The Grail Message clarifies that the soul's progress depends not on the approval of others, but on inner purification, clarity, and adherence to divine law. Forgiveness, therefore, becomes a sovereign act of the spirit, liberating, radiant, and morally intact, while reconciliation is a separate, optional outcome dictated by wisdom, circumstances, and readiness of all involved parties. In daily practice, this distinction empowers individuals to release their inner burdens without compromising safety or integrity. A person may meditate, pray, or consciously forgive the offender, fully letting go of bitterness, yet choose to limit contact, enforce boundaries, or allow time for the offender to transform. Forgiveness is the liberation of the self. Reconciliation is the potential re-establishment of relational harmony. The Grail Message elevates this understanding beyond sentimentality, teaching that freedom of spirit proceeds, and may exist independently of, relational restoration. Thus, the misconception that forgiveness mandates reconciliation is corrected. True forgiveness is always an inner act of radiational release, while reconciliation is a discretionary, external act, bound by law, truth, and prudence. By discerning this difference, humanity can heal without self-endangerment, uphold justice without resentment, and advance spiritually while maintaining balance in the outer world. Chapter 16. Forgiveness is instantly granted. No, forgiveness follows inner change, not words. A deeply ingrained misconception in human society is the belief that forgiveness is an instantaneous act, simply declared by speaking the words, "I forgive you." This superficial understanding confuses linguistic expression with inner transformation, overlooking the spiritual mechanics that the Grail Message reveals. True forgiveness is never a mere verbal gesture, it is a profound inner process that reflects alignment with divine law, radiational harmony, and moral clarity. Forgiveness, in its essence, is a correction of the spirit. It releases the soul from the radiational chains of anger, resentment, and attachment to past wrongdoing. These chains are not dissolved by pronouncing words, they are dissolved through conscious inner work, recognition of truth, purification of thought, acknowledgement of the natural consequences of actions, and the deliberate release of all emotional and moral entanglements connected to the offense. Until this inner work occurs, verbal declarations of forgiveness are often empty, ineffective, and sometimes even counterproductive, creating illusions of reconciliation or spiritual growth where none exists. The Grail Message teaches that every human thought and feeling carries radiational consequences. Bitterness, hatred, and unprocessed pain generate dense radiations that affect the inner world of the individual, as well as their environment and relationships. True forgiveness alters these radiations. It is a transformation that can only occur when the human being consciously engages in self-purification, renounces resentment, and aligns with the laws of spiritual justice. Without this conscious effort, the words, "I forgive," are mere sound. They do not alter the spiritual reality and may even intensify inner conflict if spoken prematurely. Moreover, forgiveness is intimately linked to inner moral understanding. It requires seeing the broader context of human fallibility, recognizing the role of free will, and discerning the natural consequences of actions. Only when the soul comprehends these truths can it genuinely release attachment to the offense and its effects. Instantaneous forgiveness, claimed without such understanding, often leaves the individual emotionally entangled, radiationally burdened, and spiritually vulnerable. True release is gradual, reflective, and transformative. It follows inner change, not expediency or social expectation. Practically, this means that the process of forgiveness may involve meditation, prayer, reflection, and the conscious effort to relinquish judgment and anger. It is a progression of the spirit from reaction to understanding, from inner bondage to radiational freedom. While the conscious decision to forgive can begin immediately, the completion of forgiveness, the full liberation of the soul, unfolds in harmony with spiritual law, personal growth, and the purification of inner radiations. The Grail Message thus corrects the widespread error. Forgiveness is not an instantaneous gift delivered by words alone. It is a moral and spiritual journey, a radiational realignment, and a conscious transformation. Only after this inner work can the words of forgiveness truly reflect reality. Humanity, misled by social convention and emotional superficiality, often mistakes verbal declarations for spiritual liberation. The teaching is clear. Forgiveness is earned within, radiationally manifested, and only then expressed outwardly with authenticity and power. By embracing this understanding, humans can approach forgiveness with seriousness and clarity. They learn to value inner transformation above appearances, to respect the laws of creation, and to act in alignment with divine law. Forgiveness becomes a genuine source of liberation, healing, and radiational light, a true correction in the human soul, rather than a fleeting, performative gesture. Chapter 17. Forgiveness means overlooking evil, why overlooking wrongdoing fosters spiritual harm. One of the most insidious misconceptions about forgiveness is the belief that to forgive is to overlook, excuse, or condone wrongdoing. Humanity has long been taught, in the name of mercy or emotional comfort, that to forgive is to ignore the gravity of misdeeds. The Grail Message, however, illuminates a deeper spiritual truth. Overlooking evil does not liberate the spirit, it endangers it. Genuine forgiveness requires clarity, moral discernment, and the recognition of consequences. To overlook wrongdoing is to suspend judgment without correcting the underlying imbalance. It is to deny the soul the opportunity to comprehend the moral reality of actions and to align with the laws of cause and effect. Every wrongful act generates a chain of consequences in the spiritual realm, manifesting radiationally in the human soul and its surroundings. When a person pretends that evil does not exist, the radiational patterns of the offense remain unresolved. Bitterness, resentment, and confusion may persist subtly, entangling both the victim and the perpetrator in cycles of karmic tension. True forgiveness does not require one to approve of wrongdoing. Instead, it requires a conscious decision to release the inner burden of anger and resentment while simultaneously acknowledging the moral truth of the act. The Grail Message emphasizes that justice and forgiveness are not contradictory, rather, forgiveness completes justice. By facing the wrong clearly, comprehending its causes, and consciously choosing to release the inner tension it creates, the soul restores radiational equilibrium. Overlooking evil, however, bypasses this necessary inner work, leaving the spirit vulnerable to repetition, entanglement, and the subtle influence of lower forces. Furthermore, overlooking evil confuses the human soul about moral boundaries. If wrongdoing is habitually ignored, the human consciousness may become desensitized, forming an inner tolerance for error and injustice. This tolerance distorts spiritual perception, weakens discernment, and dulls the conscience. The Grail Message warns that such misalignment creates spiritual vulnerability, allowing lower impulses and influences to penetrate and destabilize the inner life. Forgiveness without recognition of evil is not a liberation, it is a self-imposed blindness that obstructs growth and clarity. The correct path, therefore, is a conscious and discerning forgiveness. The wrong is acknowledged, understood, and allowed to have its rightful consequences, yet the soul releases the binding chains of resentment and bitterness. This is a higher form of moral and spiritual intelligence, in which the soul no longer reacts from ego or fear but acts in accordance with divine law. Forgiveness in this sense becomes a radiational correction. It aligns the human being with creation's order while allowing justice to remain intact. By rejecting the false notion that forgiveness equates to overlooking evil, humanity can cultivate inner clarity, strength, and true compassion. Forgiveness becomes an act of conscious liberation rather than self-deception. It teaches the soul to face truth with courage, to release negativity without condoning wrongdoing, and to maintain alignment with the eternal laws of justice, reciprocity, and radiational harmony. Chapter 18. Radiational Blockages: How Resentment Suffocates Intuition and Spiritual Movement. When a human soul refuses to forgive, it creates an internal obstruction that is invisible yet profoundly real in the spiritual realm. The Grail Message reveals that human consciousness operates through radiations, streams of spiritual life force that connect thought, emotion, and action to the higher laws of creation. Resentment, bitterness, and unresolved anger interrupt these currents, producing what can be called radiational blockages. These blockages are not merely emotional burdens, they are energetic distortions that cloud perception, weaken moral discernment, and inhibit the natural flow of the soul toward higher awareness. The Grail teaches that every feeling, thought, and will emits a radiation. When negative emotions are sustained, especially those rooted in unforgiveness, the soul radiates a disharmonious vibration that repels the light of higher guidance. Intuition, the soul's natural instrument for perceiving truth beyond the material, becomes dulled. Inspiration falters. Even spiritual exercises, prayer, or meditation lose clarity and potency because the channels of reception are clogged. Unforgiveness also generates a subtle accumulation of inner tension. The human spirit becomes entangled with the object of its anger, creating a psychic tether that limits freedom. This entanglement disturbs not only the inner life of the individual but also the surrounding radiational environment. Those who refuse to release resentment may inadvertently radiate these distortions into their relationships, communities, and even the natural world, creating a ripple effect of disharmony. The Grail Message emphasizes that the laws of reciprocal action apply radiationally. What one holds within manifests outwardly in some form, whether consciously perceived or not. Moreover, radiational blockages prevent the soul from receiving higher influences. Divine guidance, spiritual assistance, and corrective energies cannot penetrate a field clouded by unresolved negativity. The soul, therefore, remains in partial isolation from its own higher essence. Unforgiveness is not a mere personal matter, it is a deviation from the natural order of creation. The blockage impairs spiritual development, prolongs suffering, and strengthens the ties to lower impulses and reactive tendencies. The Grail Message instructs that the remedy is conscious release. Forgiveness, correctly understood, clears the blockage not by ignoring truth or condoning wrongdoing but by releasing the inner entanglement. It is an act of radiational correction. The soul aligns once again with the streams of spiritual light and life, restoring flow, clarity, and receptivity. When forgiveness occurs, intuition sharpens, moral discernment awakens, and spiritual movement becomes possible again. The soul regains its natural rhythm and is no longer fettered by the energetic weight of resentment. In sum, refusal to forgive suffocates the soul's radiational channels, impairs intuition, and freezes spiritual movement. Forgiveness, as a deliberate act of liberation, restores these channels, harmonizes the soul, and permits the human being to receive the higher currents of creation. It is a law of nature, not merely a moral suggestion. To forgive is to allow the soul to breathe freely in the light of truth. Chapter 19. Chains to the Offender, the Invisible Bonds Created by Bitterness. The Grail Message teaches that human beings are not isolated islands of existence but part of an interconnected spiritual web, where every thought, emotion, and will radiates into the surrounding spiritual and material environment. Bitterness, resentment, and refusal to forgive create invisible bonds, chains that link the soul to the very person or situation it resents. Unlike physical chains, these are subtle but no less binding. They are formed through the radiations of unresolved anger and emotional clinging. When a person clings to bitterness, their soul emits radiations that continuously draw it back toward the offender or the perceived wrong. Each thought of resentment, each rehearsal of the grievance, strengthens the attachment, binding the individual in an energetic loop. The Grail Message clarifies that this is not only an emotional state but a spiritual law. As long as the soul clings to the injury, it remains energetically tethered, unable to move freely into the light of forgiveness and higher consciousness. These chains are inherently limiting. They enslave the soul to the past, preventing it from acting in freedom and clarity in the present. The energy expended in sustaining resentment is energy diverted from spiritual growth, from acts of love, and from constructive engagement with life. In effect, the offender continues to influence the soul long after the external event has passed, not through active malice but through the spiritual inertia of bitterness. The Grail Message underscores that this is a self-created imprisonment. The bonds are invisible, yet their grip is real, forming a cycle of suffering that cannot be broken by avoidance or repression alone. Furthermore, the chains radiate into the surrounding environment, affecting relationships and interactions. People in persistent unforgiveness unconsciously attract experiences and circumstances that mirror their inner state. These radiations reinforce the entanglement, creating repeated lessons, similar circumstances, or interactions that reflect the original grievance. The Grail clarifies that this is not punishment from a higher power but the natural operation of spiritual law. Like attracts like, and unresolved negativity seeks resonance until corrected by conscious realignment. The release of these chains is achieved only through genuine forgiveness. This does not mean condoning wrongdoing, pretending harm did not occur, or sacrificing justice. Rather, it is an internal act of liberation. The soul consciously loosens the ties, letting go of attachment to the person, act, or outcome. Through this act, the radiational field is cleared, the bonds dissolve, and the soul regains the freedom to move in alignment with truth and divine order. Forgiveness turns the radiations from a constricting force into a harmonizing current, allowing the soul to rise above past grievances. In conclusion, bitterness creates invisible but potent chains that bind the soul to the offender, obstruct spiritual freedom, and perpetuate suffering. Forgiveness is the act that releases these chains, restores energetic clarity, and frees the soul to receive higher guidance. The Grail Message illuminates that liberation from these bonds is both a duty and a law. The soul cannot ascend while shackled by resentment. Chapter 20. Karmic Entanglement Through Hatred. Why refusing to forgive binds one to the offender in future lifetimes. The Grail Message teaches that human life is governed by immutable spiritual laws. Among these, the law of reciprocal action, the natural consequence of every thought, word, and deed, operates across the boundaries of time and space. Unforgiveness, resentment, and hatred are not transient emotions that vanish with the passing of a day. They leave radiational imprints that shape the soul's trajectory and can extend into future incarnations. When a person harbors hatred or refuses to forgive, the energy emitted by the soul is heavy, dense, and obstructive. This radiational pattern does not dissipate easily. It lingers in the spiritual environment, creating a subtle resonance that attracts similar energies. In the Grail Message, this is understood as karmic entanglement. The soul remains spiritually tethered to the person or situation against which it feels grievance. These bonds are not visible to the eye but are real in their effect, subtly influencing the soul's path, its circumstances, and its interactions across time. The mechanism is simple yet profound. Every act of hatred or persistent resentment creates a spiritual echo that returns in equal measure to the originator. The soul becomes caught in cycles of repetition. It may encounter the same lesson in another life, experience similar betrayals, or attract individuals who mirror the unresolved conflict. This is not punishment imposed externally but the natural working of the law of reciprocity. The soul learns through experience. Unresolved energy compels the soul to face the lesson until true correction, through forgiveness, is achieved. Karmic entanglement also carries subtle burdens. It clouds intuition, inhibits spiritual perception, and hinders the soul's alignment with divine will. The Grail Message highlights that these entanglements are most dangerous because they are self-perpetuated. By refusing forgiveness, the soul unknowingly plants seeds for future suffering. Just as a seed grows in accordance with the nature of what is sown, hatred and resentment produce future circumstances in which the soul must confront its own obstinacy. Without conscious intervention, this cycle may span multiple lifetimes, each repetition offering opportunity for awakening, yet each burdening the soul further. True liberation requires conscious forgiveness, not for the benefit of the offender, but for the liberation of the soul itself. By letting go of resentment, the soul cancels the karmic attraction that would otherwise bind it to repetition. Forgiveness transforms the dense radiations of hatred into lighter, harmonizing currents that restore freedom and open the soul to higher guidance. The Grail Message emphasizes that this is not optional. The path of spiritual maturity demands the resolution of such entanglements, for no soul can ascend while bound by unresolved hatred. In summary, refusing to forgive creates karmic entanglements that extend across lifetimes. Hatred binds the soul to the offender, perpetuating cycles of suffering and repetition. Forgiveness is the key to breaking these bonds, restoring spiritual freedom, and allowing the soul to rise in alignment with divine law. In this way, the Grail Message illuminates forgiveness not merely as a moral act but as a spiritual necessity, essential for liberation and eternal growth. Chapter 21. The Descent into Darkness, How the Soul Sinks When It Clings to Wrath. The Grail Message teaches that the spiritual condition of the human soul is profoundly affected by the quality of its inner life. Wrath, hatred, and persistent unforgiveness are not mere emotional disturbances, they are powerful distortions in the soul's radiational field. These negative radiations create a gravitational pull toward spiritual darkness, weakening the connection to higher realms and impeding the inflow of divine guidance. When the soul clings to wrath, it fosters a dense, heavy radiational pattern. This density acts as a barrier between the soul and the currents of light and truth that sustain spiritual development. The longer resentment persists, the more entrenched this darkness becomes, shaping the soul's perception, judgment, and behavior. The Grail Message emphasizes that such spiritual contraction leads to a progressive decline. The soul becomes increasingly self-centered, defensive, and isolated from the harmonizing forces of creation. This descent is not external punishment but a natural consequence of spiritual law. Every thought of wrath, every act of inner clinging to injury, attracts similar energies, lower vibrational influences, unresolved karmic forces, and occasionally spiritistic entities, that further reinforce the soul's darkened state. The Grail Message repeatedly points out that the soul's environment is a mirror of its inner condition. As wrath solidifies, the soul perceives the world through distortion, responding with more bitterness, and thus accelerating its descent. The danger lies not only in the immediate suffering but in the long-term consequences for spiritual evolution. Souls that cling to wrath experience stagnation. They cannot rise to higher planes because their radiational state repels higher guidance. Moreover, this darkness tends to cloud moral discernment, leading the soul to justify actions that further entangle it in negativity. In essence, wrath becomes a self-perpetuating prison, cutting the soul off from the laws of creation that sustain life, harmony, and spiritual ascent. True deliverance from this descent requires the active exercise of forgiveness. Forgiveness is not a sentimental gesture, it is a conscious radiational correction. By releasing wrath, the soul transforms heavy, obstructive currents into harmonious ones, reopening the path to light. The Grail Message underscores that the moment the soul consciously relinquishes hatred, it begins to rise again, regaining clarity, freedom, and the ability to attract beneficial forces. In this process, the soul not only liberates itself but restores the balance of the surrounding spiritual environment. In conclusion, clinging to wrath propels the soul downward into darkness, obstructing guidance, attracting harmful influences, and limiting spiritual evolution. Forgiveness, as revealed by the Grail Message, is the precise remedy. It dissolves the heavy radiations of anger, restores inner balance, and allows the soul to ascend. The descent and the ascent are not metaphorical. They are real movements of spiritual energy, dictated by immutable law. The choice lies with the human spirit, to remain bound by wrath or to release it and reclaim the light of its true nature. Chapter 22. Emotional and Physical Illness from Unforgiveness, the burden the soul forces onto the body. The Grail Message teaches that the human being is a composite of spirit, soul, and body, each level deeply interwoven with the others. The soul, as the inner radiating core, governs the flow of life forces that sustain physical vitality and emotional stability. When the soul clings to unforgiveness, resentment, or hatred, it disturbs these life forces, creating dense, disharmonious radiations that reverberate throughout the entire being. Unforgiveness is not a passive state, it is an active obstruction. Each negative thought, every lingering grudge, produces radiational distortions that contract the soul and tighten the mental and emotional faculties. This inner contraction manifests physically as tension, stress, and disruption in the body's natural equilibrium. Headaches, digestive issues, cardiovascular strain, and weakened immunity are often the corporeal echoes of unresolved spiritual blockages. The Grail Message makes clear that these are not random ailments but consequences of spiritual imbalance imposed upon the material form. Emotionally, unforgiveness feeds cycles of anxiety, depression, irritability, and fear. The soul's radiational contraction limits clarity, suppresses joy, and amplifies perceptions of threat or injustice. These emotional disturbances, in turn, feed the body's tension, creating a feedback loop where mental suffering becomes physical suffering, and vice versa. The soul's refusal to release the past binds the human being to repeated patterns of stress, pain, and disharmony. The Grail Message emphasizes that true healing arises when the soul corrects its radiational misalignment. Forgiveness is the tool that dissolves the inner tensions caused by resentment. As the soul consciously releases grudges, anger, and bitterness, the obstructive radiations dissipate. This restoration allows life forces to circulate freely, rebalancing both emotional and physical states. The body, long burdened by the weight of the soul's negativity, can then regenerate, and the emotional life attains calm and clarity. It is important to understand that forgiveness does not mean condoning wrongs or submitting to injustice. Rather, it is the conscious lifting of internal burdens. The Grail Message teaches that by forgiving, the soul stops enforcing suffering upon itself and the body, breaking the cycle of illness that stems from spiritual contraction. Forgiveness becomes a restorative radiational process, a bridge reconnecting the human being with harmony, health, and spiritual clarity. In summary, unforgiveness is a heavy burden the soul forces upon the body and mind. Emotional and physical illnesses are often outward signs of these inner radiational blockages. The Grail Message illuminates that only by consciously forgiving can the soul release these burdens, restore the flow of life forces, and allow both body and spirit to experience the fullness of health, vitality, and inner peace.